Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the City of Menasha Administration Committee meeting to order. Deputy Clerk Newman, could you call the roll, please?
Alderman Taylor.
Here.
Alderman Sevenik.
Here.
Alderman Langdon.
Here.
Alderman Tom Grady.
Here.
Alderman Ted Grady.
Here.
Alderman Rapella.
Here.
All are here with the, and Alderman Nichols, of course.
Here.
All are here with the exception of Alderman Schmidt, who has been excused.
Thank you. Our first item of business this evening is to approve the minutes from the Administration Committee meeting of August 2nd. Is there a motion? Alderman Rapella.
Thank you very much. I'll make the motion to approve the minutes from the Administration Committee on 8/2/2021.
Second.
We have a motion from Alderman Rapella and a second from Alderman Ted Grady to approve the minutes from the August 2nd meeting. Are there any questions, corrections, or discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. We have one discussion and action item this evening. That is to review and accept the 2020 City of Menasha financial audit performed by Clifton Larson Allen, LLP. And Attorney Captain, if I'm recalling correctly, this is simply accepted at the Administration Committee level? Is that correct?
Correct.
Great,
Yes.
thank you. So an appropriate motion at the end of the presentation would be to accept the financial audit. This evening, we have Dan and Sue from Clifton Larson Allen to review the audit with us. New faces, welcome, and thank you for being here this evening. This is your document, so you take it over and run us through.
Okay, I will. Thank you for having us. My name is Sue Pobley. I'm a principal at CLA, and I'm responsible for the overall audit of the city. Dan is a Dan is a manager at CLA, and he's responsible for the day-to-day operations of the audit. So you should have received two documents, a bound annual financial report and a stapled executive summary. So we'll be going through those at a fairly high level, but we welcome any of your questions. So we'll start with the bound document, and we'll start on page 1. We always like to start with the auditor's opinion, so everyone has an understanding of what it reflects and the responsibilities of the city and of the auditors. So the second paragraph talks about management's responsibility. Even though we prepare this document for you as a non-audit service, management is responsible for the preparation and fair presentations of these financial statements in accordance with accounting standards. Management, the city, is also responsible for designing, implementing, and maintaining internal control systems that for the preparation and fair presentation of these financial statements. Our responsibility is to perform procedures to obtain audit evidence in order to support our opinion on the financial statements. So on the bottom of page 1, we actually talk about our opinion, and our opinion is that these financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position and the changes in financial position and cash flows of the statements therein. This is what's called the clean opinion, is what you may have heard it called. If you turn to page 2, I just want to point out a change in this year's statement. I think as was mentioned in last year's audit, there was a new accounting standard that had to be implemented this year. It was GASB 84, fiduciary activities. What that involved is we had to report in a custodial fund amounts that you are holding for other governments, individuals, entities. And for the city, that's primarily the property taxes that you collect for the school districts, the county, and that you remit to those entities after year end. Then if we turn to page 4 of the report, I like to think of the statements as two separate statements. Page 4, 5, and 6 are what we call government-wide. It reports for all activities of the city and includes all balances, including long-term balances like capital assets, long-term debt, and any like pension obligations you have or other post-employment obligations you have.
Excuse me, have we moved to the bound?
Yeah, we're going to be on the bound.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we're on page 4 there?
Yes,
Thank you.
sure. So you can think of the government-wide statements as they're on full accrual accounting like you would account for a business. You include all your assets and liabilities in there. The total net position for the governmental activities this year was $25 million with unrestricted net deficit of $3.7 million. That's an improvement over last year. The deficit last year was $9.6 million. And your total net position is positive, but we pull out amounts that you have invested in capital assets, and then you have certain restricted funds that can only be used for that specified purpose. So overall, the city on the whole government-wide basis had a very good year. Then if you turn to page 7, these are the governmental fund statements. You can think of these as the basis that you budget on. So these statements do not include your long-term items, so capital assets aren't reflected and long-term debt isn't reflected. So you have 3 major funds, and we do a mathematical calculation. They're typically your biggest funds, or funds that are of particular interest to the city. Those are your main funds that we show, and the other governmental funds are the smaller funds, and they're shown in detail in the back of the report. But we like to focus on the general fund, and total fund balance was $3.5 million this year. There's parts of that are non-spendable for inventory and long-term advances to the other funds, specifically the TIF funds, and then some fund balance that is assigned for specific purposes, but your unassigned balance was $2.2 million, and that was up from $1.9 million last year. So that's a positive improvement as well. Dan's now, so where we are?
Yep.
Dan's now going to talk about page 13, which is the budget to actual statement, and talk about some variances between the budget and actual amounts.
Thank you. And as Sue mentioned, with the other non-major funds of the city, if you have any questions on them, they start on page 72, where they're described in the back of the financials of the bound copy. Starting on page 13, for the general fund budget to actual statement, I just wanted to focus on a few numbers of area of note of activity that happened in the year that was affected mostly largely due to COVID and the additional funding that the city received. The first line is the intergovernmental revenues line, the third line on the revenue section, showing a positive budget variance of $590,000. There were additional funding that the health department received related to COVID in various programs that had increased funding to counteract everything that was happening with that. In addition to that, there was also $281,000 that was received under the CARES Act funding for the routes to recovery. So that's reflected in the budget in actuals for the year, which was not a case when the budget was originally approved and amended and the numbers were adjusted. Going down to the expenditures section, the 2 major areas of note are public safety and culture and rec. For public safety, there was a positive budget variance of $331,906. The main areas related to a lot of the salaries, wages, benefits of Department 801, which is the police department. with that in mind, the 8,778,000 for the budget compared to the 844,600, a lot of that related to expenses being down for things like overtime decreasing and specific areas with the police department. Going for the culture and rec section, there was a positive budget variance of 206,616. With COVID and with certain sections of the Parks and Rec department being shut down during that, both revenues and expenses in those areas were down from prior year, as would have been budgeted for based on last year. So that affected the expenditures being down compared to budget. All of those numbers for the revenues and expenses get down to the bottom line, showing that the city had a 968,932 positive budget variance, meaning both revenues were up compared to budget as a whole and expenses were down compared to budget from the year.
Alderman Sevenick?
That's right, I'm sorry. Forgot we were in administration. Under Health and Human Services, I don't know why we call it that, but that's what they call it at the county level. The negative balance there of various final budget, what is the 57,881? Why is that a?
I believe the main effect of that related to, with the COVID funding, there was additional costs and additional personnel added onto it for the contact tracing part of it, which was not originally budgeted for.
Right.
So adding that increase onto
So
that.
that's what's reflected and not the monies that we received to pay
Correct.
for that?
Correct. That's the expenditures area, so the additional expenses are not netted with the revenue. The revenue up top in the intergovernmental revenues would be reflected with what was received to reimburse the city for that. So that takes for the general fund budget actual, and if there are any other questions on that. One area that I wanted to focus on with the governmental funds would be the tax incremental districts. We've been working with Jennifer for the closure of the TID 6 audit, which is in process right now and should be going through the final processes momentarily. Along with the TIDs, when you look on page, what's that? I believe it's page 7 of your bound copy. In the other governmental funds line on page 7, there's a large unassigned negative amount of 4.307 million. The majority of that relates to the tax incremental districts and how, through their operation for the life of the TID, they are operating more on a deficit as they do all their projects. As all the projects come in, the expenses are going to be going into those funds, with other general fund and other funds supporting them until the tax increments come in throughout the life of the TID. So that 4.3 million is mostly reflected from those tax incremental districts and the negative fund balance, which is completely normal throughout the life of the TIDs.
So on page 7,
Sorry about that.
page 7.
Yep.
If you go down under the very last section is fund balances. The very last line is unassigned. And if you go over to the last column, the other governmental columns, the negative 4.3 million. Yep. That's primarily the TID.
That's how you do it.
Correct.
There you go.
I apologize for that. The breakdown of each of the TIDs is reflected in supplemental schedules in the back. I believe they're in the 70s, somewhere back there. Each one of the TIDs will be explained in there as far as their activity for the year. And there are separate budget to actual statements for all of the city's governmental funds, starting on page 96 of that report, going through to page 106. If there are any areas in those funds that you have further questions on, we can dive into that further. But as I mentioned, with the tax incremental districts, the activity reflected in the unassigned fund balance is completely normal.
Now, if you turn to page 18, we'll talk about the city's enterprise funds. Enterprise funds are those funds that through user charges are to recover their own costs. And so they run like a business. They're supposed to cover their costs. And the city has three: Menasha Utilities, the sewage treatment, and the stormwater utility. Menasha Utilities, CLA does audit, but it's a different audit team. So I believe they had a meeting with Menasha Utilities to go over their audit. And so we just pull their numbers in to the city's report. The sewage treatment center, what number we like to focus on is the operating income or loss. And that's right after, it's operating revenues, operating expenses, and then the line operating income loss. So if you notice, go down over to the sewage treatment column. The sewage treatment had a operating income of $247,000, and that was mainly due to two things. Last year, it was compared to about a $604,000 operating income. The difference was mainly two things. In last year's, there was an insurance settlement for about $111,000. That would have been included in the revenues. And this year, there were additional sewer lateral repairs, around $160,000, that didn't occur last year. For the stormwater utility, we have an operating income of $183,000 compared to $262,000 last year. And this was overall comparable, I'd say. There was nothing really that stood out of the ordinary to us. Okay. The last thing I'd like to cover then in the report is if you go all the way back to page 119.
119.
As part of our audit, we also review the city's internal control system. We don't give an opinion on the internal control system, but we do we will note any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies that we are aware of, that we become aware of during the audit. And we report one, and we report this one for most of the governments that we work with. And it was in the city's report last year as well, is for preparation of the annual financial report. We as auditors preparing the financial statement itself is an internal control procedures. And as independent auditors, we can't be part of your controls. So if we prepare your report, we automatically have to give an internal control deficiency for it. It is by no means reflection on the city or the finance staff. It's just something that if we assist with the report, we have to report on.
Are there any questions for Sue and Dan? Sue, right? I got it, okay. I have one question, back to page 18,
Okay?
where the enterprise funds are broken out. Is there another place where we can see Menasha Utilities divided into electric and water?
There is summary information, I believe, in the report. They get their own separate report, but we put summary financial information starting on page 64 of the report. We only show the electric and water because per accounting standards, we only have to show those, they're called segments, that have, is it refunding debt?
I believe.
That only have refunding debt. So we'll show those two, we won't show the telecommunications and the other utilities.
Alderman
Okay,
Nichols,
and is there a comparison from 2020 and 2019 on those pages, or is this just 2020?
It is just
It is
2020.
Okay.
And I apologize, I didn't bring 19 with me.
That's okay. We
Alderman
have it.
Nichols, if you'd like a copy of the Menasha Utilities audit, I'm sure we could get one. It's also on the agendas page for them. It was maybe 2 months ago.
Yeah, I recall seeing it
Yeah,
in the
so-
minutes. I just can't read that kind of stuff online.
I'm sure we could get you a hard copy if you'd like one too.
All right, thank you. That's all for my questions. Anything from anyone else?
Can we
Thank-
quick go over a few things in
Sure.
in here? Just real quick.
I thought that's where we started, so I was confused. We're going to the stapled
Stapled documents.
top, document.
So if you turn to page 2 in the stapled document, there are certain things that accounting standards require us to report to the governance board. So, and I'd just like to go over there. Under the significant audit findings section, the last paragraph, we noted no transactions entered into the entity by the city during the year for which there was a lack of authoritative guidance, and all significant transactions were recorded in the proper period. By their nature, certain items in the financial statements are estimates. And that includes things like your other post-employment benefits, your pension, which are actuarial studies, the fair value of investments, which we use off of, we go off of your investment manager statements, but yet until they're sold, they're still estimates, and that's normal in an audit. On page 3, we had no difficulties performing the audit. Jennifer and her team were wonderful to work with. There were no uncorrected misstatements, meaning that we noted no errors or things that had to be corrected that were not. Of those corrected misstatements, none of them were material. We had no disagreements with management. I think that was all for, I had to cover it. Oh, and then page 5 is just the internal control communication that we talked to earlier. Page 8 starts just some general information, summary information from the financial statements that we pull out into a separate document to make it a little bit easier to focus on and to understand.
And we touched on the general fund earlier with their numbers. The general fund is detailed out by the types of the fund balance that it's made up of, that $3.5 million in the general fund, with the unassigned fund balance at 2.247, which is an increase of that 1.897 that Sue mentioned earlier. And as you go down the line, you will notice all the special revenue funds and then the capital project funds of the city as of the year end and of the prior year, with the note of those tax incremental district amounts that I mentioned previously. Going over to page 9 is a section related to the outstanding debt of the city as a whole. We have broken that out with the amounts for the general city and then the breakdown of what the Menasha utilities portion is. The total numbers of the general obligation debt of the $35,354,041, that all is reflected in the financial statement footnotes of the cities in the bound document. We just broke it out separately with Menasha Utilities and the city so that you can get a understanding of where the city is at minus Menasha Utilities. Going down to the next section, the legal margin of debt for the city, there's the equalized value amount, and then down to the calculation, which takes into account the outstanding debt of the city as a whole. The city has 26 million of debt capacity to be able to loan out funds in the future, which is in a very healthy position for the city. And I apologize, we don't have what it was last year in there as well.
Page 10,
Alderman Rapella?
Thank you. Could you go through, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have you go back way to the top of the page.
Yeah.
Where it says total GO debt. So the principal for 2021 was 11,906,655. So go through and just address, so that, how to read that, just those last two or that
Oh, yep,
last two
yep.
columns.
So there are 3 different columns, or 6 different columns. The total column, that 2021 line, that is reflective of the principal that is due in 2021, because these numbers are reflective as of December 31st, 2020. So there are 11,906,655 of outstanding debt that is due for the principal portion in 2021. I believe a portion of that relates to some funding that is going to be refunded into long-term debt coming in 2021. So that's why that number is so much higher compared to the following years after that. I believe so, yeah, the line of credit, and that's going to be refunded.
So is that the money that, or the bridge loan or something? Sorry, Becky. I keep thinking we're in that first committee.
And then why is it 26 to 30, 9 million? What happened there?
Sorry, what
And then
numbers?
2026 to 2030, the year span?
Oh, so, for standards, for accounting standards, when we present these numbers, we're required to present 5 years in single, and then after the first 5 years, then we have to do 5 years at a time. So that's just a way to condense the information when the years of outstanding debt are so
Okay.
far in the future.
All right, thank you. So our total debt that we need is, or that we're in debt, was that 35 billion?
Correct. And then the final line is the interest reflective of, that's due in that fiscal year.
Oh. Okay,
So on top of the 35 million, there's an additional 3.8 million of interest that's attached to that principal that's outstanding.
okay. So are we ever making a dent in the 35 million, or are we just paying the interest? Jennifer?
Keep in mind that in the middle, you see Menache Utilities, that's the water,
Oh,
oh, sorry.
okay, go ahead.
that's the water utility debt that's in there as well.
Okay,
But it's part of our GO debt, but just keep that in mind.
okay.
We'll look at last year's report and see what that number. We'll look at last year's report quick and see what that number was last year.
Thank you.
26 point
The grand total, so the total GO debt principal column this year is 35.3 million. Last year it was 27.3 million.
Oh,
But that's reflective of the Public Works facility.
Correct.
yeah, I
Work,
figured that one
so-
out. Thank you.
Any other questions, Alderman Rapella?
No, thank you very much for allowing me to
Touched on.
ask some questions.
You're welcome. Mayor Merkus?
If I may, I believe we, at the height of our debt, about 8 years ago, we were at about 37 million. So we have been paying off significant debt. It's just that we added some new on for the Public Works facility.
We built a new building.
Okay, so page 10 through 13 is specific information on the internal service funds. Those are funds that service other departments of the city. I wasn't going to specifically cover those unless you had some questions.
Any questions on internal service funds, including the city garage, dental insurance, property liability insurance, information technology, post-employment sick benefits? Seeing none, we'll move on.
Okay, so page 14, I just wanted to point out that the standard-setting body for all governments is the Governmental Accounting Standard Boards, and they've been very busy lately. And the next one coming up will be effective for year-ended December 31st, 2022, and it significantly changes lease accounting, where if you lease a material item, we're going to have to actually record the asset on the financial statement. So there'll be big changes coming that year. So I just wanted to point that out. We'll be working with Jennifer on that. Then lastly, it's not in here, we're done with the bound document. I just wanted to point with all the COVID-related funding that the city has been getting, if that money, if you expend over $750,000 in a single year of federal awards, you are required to have what's called a single audit. What that means is that single audit is a compliance audit, checking that the expenditures you made on those federal grants are in compliance with how those grants should have been spent.
Keep it $1 under.
That would be nice, we would like that. It is likely for 2021, you will likely have to have a single audit, so that'll be an additional document that we'll release, or in the audit as well.
Okay.
So, and then we'd just like to thank you. CLA really appreciates serving the city. So, and Jennifer and her team have been great to work with, very responsive, got us the information that we needed timely, so we really appreciate that as well.
Good to know. Thank you so much. Any further questions? Seeing none, we'll look for a motion to accept the City of Menasha financial audit as completed by Clifton Larson Allen LLP for 2020. Alderman Rapella?
Thank you very much, Alderman Nichols. I move to review and accept the 2020 City of Menasha financial audit done by Clifton Larson and Allen for this year.
Is there a second? We have a motion by Alderman Rapella and a second by Alderman Taylor to accept the 2020 financial audit. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. The report is accepted. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and safe travels back home. Take care. And with that, we'll look for a motion to adjourn. Motion by Alderman Taylor. Is there a second? Second by Alderman Tom Grady to adjourn. All in favor say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.